Okay, bueno, buenos días. Good morning. Thank you all for joining. My name is Zoe Colon. I'm Associate Director of Global Perspectives and International Initiatives at UCF and proudly serve as Senior Advisor to the Puerto Rico Research Hub. Just wanted to say hello and welcome you to probably the fifth Hispanic Heritage Month event that we have at UCF put on by the Hub. And we are so excited to have you. Thank you for joining. I'm going to go ahead and pass it along to Dr. Rivera, who is the director for the Puerto Rico Research Hub.
So thank you, Zoe. Buenos dias, everyone. Good morning. We have a wonderful panel today. And I think when we were planning the events for Hispanic Heritage Month, we wanted to make sure to bring a sort of this federal relationship between Puerto Rico and the territories. And sometimes, in terms of the media and what captures the attention, sometimes we overlook the very important issues that we're going to discuss here today. So we have a wonderful panel out here, and I'm going to turn it over to Neil and the other panelists just for a brief introduction, who you are, who you work with, and some initial remarks, and then we'll get into the core of the conversation. So thank you, everybody, for being here. So Neil, you have the floor.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Rivera, and it's been great to get to know you and collaborate with folks at UCF on these issues. My name is Neil Weir, and I'm president and founder of Equally American, nonprofit advocacy organization that fights for equal rights and civil rights for the 3.5 million citizens living in US territories. I myself actually grew up in Guam, although I've spent a lot of time in Puerto Rico and each of the territories. And over the years, we've really seen these issues, federal issues affecting the territories, kind of morph and change over time. I really kind of look at it almost in a pre-Maria and a post-Maria context in terms of the interest and engagement at a national level. And all of this is really built up to a critical moment in the coming months where really all three branches of the federal government will have critical opportunities to act on issues facing Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico and residents of the other US territories in ways that literally have life and death consequences. And so look forward to talking more about that in the panel today.
Thank you, Neil. Javier?
Yeah, I'll mute myself. Hi, everyone. Good morning, buenos dias. And thank you to UCF and Dr. Rivera for hosting this panel. My name is Javier Balmaceda, and I work as a senior policy analyst for the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, CBPP. At the center, we focus on state and federal policies, mostly through an analysis of the budget to try to alleviate poverty and help low-income families throughout the US. About 3 years ago, the center carved out a post to start looking at Puerto Rico specifically, and that's the post that I'm blessed to have to this day. The work has been slowly expanding to the territories as well. And I think, as Neil was saying, when it comes to the territories, the great tragedy is that the territories are usually the places where poverty rates are the highest, yet it's also the place where the safety net is least present. And so a lot of our work focuses on trying to close those gaps. And we've been trying to provide a more academic literature and a more closer look to what these gaps are and how they affect all the populations in the territories. And the work has been expanding, and I hope to talk a little bit more about that today, and also how these deep federal disparities have affected the territories for many decades. And with that, I will pass it on back to Dr. Rivera.
Thank you, Javier. Very important topics. And Federico is joining us as well. So Federico, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Rivera and Zoe and UCF for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here in this panel, not only with you and our audience, but with my good friends Neil and Javier, who I've collaborated with on several of the issues we're going to talk about today. My name is Federico de Jesus. I'm a consultant in Washington, D.C., born and raised in Puerto Rico, and I work with several diaspora groups and think tanks, including Power for Puerto Rico, the Center for American Progress, and others. And today, I'd like to talk about the structural issues behind the inequalities that my colleagues will point out, mainly colonialism, what has happened with the fiscal board and the financial issues, as well as the Jones Act and other side effects of the unequal colonial relationship that Puerto Rico and the other territories have with the federal government. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Federico. And for the audience, there in the chat, you can find a link to all the biographies of our presenters today. So Neil, let's start with you. There's an upcoming case, Supreme Court case of Baello Madero. If you can sort of tell us, tell the audience what is this all about, and start the conversation out there, because usually, even if you think kind of like the press coverage and all sort of stuff, it's not necessarily in the national scope. It's not necessarily making the rounds out here. So tell me a little bit more about that, and tell an audience about what are the issues that are being discussed out here that are related to our panel today.
Yeah, there's a big Supreme Court case coming up this term, United States versus Baello Madero, that's going to be argued on November 9th in Washington, D.C. And it's a case that's going to have huge impacts, not just for Mr. Baello Madero, but also for literally hundreds of thousands of residents of Puerto Rico and residents of the other territories who are denied access to the federal benefits program, supplemental security income, which is a special program that most Americans take for granted that provides a basic income of up to $800 a month to some of the most vulnerable citizens in the country, folks who are over 65, blind, disabled, unable to work, and have little to no income or assets, really providing them just a basic level of human dignity for them to survive day to day, and also for their families to be able to survive. And the way this case came up is actually really interesting. So Mr. Baello Madero, a Puerto Rican man, was living in New York when he, because of his age and health problems, applied to and began receiving SSI benefits. A few years later, he moved home to Puerto Rico to care for ailing family members. And unbeknownst to him at the time, he didn't know that that simple move of geography, moving from the state of New York to Puerto Rico, meant that he was no longer eligible to receive SSI benefits. So these continued to be deposited in his account. He continued to receive them, important funds, again, just to give him a basic ability to care for himself and his family members. Then a few years later, the United States SSA, the federal agency that administers these programs, learned that he had moved to Puerto Rico. And so not only did they stop sending him funds, but the US Attorney's Office in Puerto Rico actually filed a criminal case against him for the receipt of funds that he had got while he was in Puerto Rico, asking him to return back approximately $28,000 that the federal government had provided him during that time period. Of course, the only reason Mr. Baello Madero was eligible for these funds at all was because he had little income and no assets. And so the idea that he would be able to return $28,000 that he had been spending on rent, basic food, things like that, was absolutely absurd. And yet, nonetheless, the United States attorneys came after him, even going to his home, seeking to have him sign documents saying that he had broke the law. Quite quickly in his court case, Judge Gustavo Helpi, who's currently been nominated to serve on the First Circuit, saw that this was a situation where this man needed some legal representation, that it seemed like the United States attorneys were playing a little bit fast and loose with him in terms of some of the things they'd had him sign. So he nominated a group of attorneys, Puerto Rican attorneys in New York at the Curtis Law Firm to serve as his pro bono representatives. Once they came in, the story of the United States changed. Now that he had real legal representation, they quickly said, oh, our bad, we want to drop this lawsuits. And they sought to request leave from the court to do so. Meanwhile, Mr. Baello Madero was making arguments in court that actually this denial of SSI benefits violates my constitutional right to equal protection, equal justice under the law, the words that are on top of the Supreme Court when you walk up the steps. He was making this basic argument for equal treatment. Judge Halpe in the case said, no, United States, I'm not going to let you withdraw at this point. I would like to hear these constitutional arguments. His lawyers made the case for him, won in the federal district court, went on to the First Circuit, where a unanimous panel led by the late and great Judge Troya ruled in favor of Mr. Vieira, saying that the United States Congress had violated equal protection by denying otherwise eligible residents of Puerto Rico SSI benefits simply based on where they live. And then the United States appealed this decision to the Supreme Court. And that's where it's interesting, in that there was a change in administration from the time period that the petition was filed and that the Supreme Court decided to take up the case. So the original appeal was made under the Trump administration. And then now that the case is before the Supreme Court, it's up to the Biden administration on whether they're going to move forward. There was a big push by many groups and individuals, members of Congress included, to call on the Biden administration to stop defending these discriminatory laws. And after all, it's something that President Biden himself had promised during the campaign for president, to say, when I become president, this ends, responding to a tweet about the appeal to the Supreme Court. Then on the day that the United States first opening brief was due, before it was filed, President Biden made a really rare and unprecedented statement about the upcoming filing, saying that the denial of SSI benefits to residents of Puerto Rico was inconsistent with his administration's values, that he does not believe that citizens anywhere should be treated as second-class citizens. These powerful words from the President of the United States, yet at the same time, the President saying, nonetheless, my Department of Justice is going to continue defending these discriminatory laws in court, filing a brief arguing that despite the absurdity of denying someone SSI benefits based solely on where they live, that there was a basis for the federal government to do so. And so that's really where the case is now. The United States has made its argument. Mr. Vieira has responded. There's been more than 24 amicus briefs filed in support of Mr. Vieira. My own organization, Equally American, has joined one of those. Many other groups like Latino Justice, Hispanic Federation, many elected officials in Puerto Rico have all come together supporting Mr. Vieira's case and supporting the efforts of others to address equality in these issues. And now in the coming month, the Supreme Court will hear oral argument in the case to take this up. But one of the things that the Supreme Court case really highlights, and this is an argument that the United States has made, that it's in the United States view, in the Department of Justice's view, this is not for the courts to decide these questions. Rather, it's up to Congress to create a solution for these issues. And that's really where there are some unprecedented political and policy opportunities in Congress right now that I'll leave some of my co-panelists to talk a little bit more about.
Thank you, Neil. And that's a great overview of some of the issues, but it's not only SSI. So Javier, can you talk a little bit, because, you know, sort of the let's say the unequal treatment, it doesn't stop there. What are some of the other issues that are being discussed, you know, with the budget discussion right now, and some of the legal issues that are going on right now? So Javier, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a safety net issue. It's a systemic issue. As I was mentioning before, it's not just SSI. There are several big safety net programs that don't apply fully in the territories. And you can talk about Medicaid, you can talk about SNAP, which is food stamps, you can talk about the tax credits. That's changed recently. You can talk about SSI. There's a whole host of programs that are meant to alleviate poverty, combat poverty in the federal government. These are programs that have been around for many decades. And yet in the territories, they either don't exist or they don't apply fully. And so in the territories also, you see the highest poverty rates out of, the whole country. In Puerto Rico alone, you look at the general poverty rate, it's 44%, which is much higher than 12% in the US. Child poverty rate is much higher, it's 58%. So you have these critical poverty levels, and yet all these programs that are designed precisely to try to treat high poverty are not fully applied in the territories. And I think the first step is closing the gaps, right? This new administration through the American Rescue Plan closed two big gaps recently with the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. These are two programs that have been around for decades and are incredibly useful to combat poverty. In the case of Puerto Rico, for example, just so you have a taste of the disparities, only families with 3 or more children could apply for the credits. The credit has been available to all family sizes in the US for 20 plus years. And due to a technical mistake 20 years ago, Puerto Rico was excluded from this. And it took 20 plus years to correct it through the American Rescue Plan. So now for the first time ever, all family sizes in Puerto Rico will have access to a credit that has been shown to alleviate child poverty big time, and it has many other benefits. And the same thing goes for the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit. This is a program that has been around since 1975, so nearly half a century. To the territories, the credit is made available very inconsistently. Puerto Rico does not have access to the federal version of the credit. And through the American Rescue Plan, for the first time ever, all the territories will have a fully funded EITC. In the case of Puerto Rico, it's going to work slightly different. The federal government will extend the supplement so that Puerto Rico can expand its local EITC. But the significance of this is that for the first time in nearly 50 years, Puerto Rico will be getting federal EITC dollars. And again, these are dollars that should have been flowing to Puerto Rico a long time ago. So I think, again, the big picture is you have big federal programs that are meant to create a safety net. And when you don't have access to that safety net, or you have limited access to it, you have a compounded effect too, right? Because each of these programs is meant to treat different things. Medicaid is supposed to address healthcare. SNAP is meant to address nutritional issues, such and such. And when you have a broken safety net, you have a compounded problem. I don't mean to say that this is the solution to all of Puerto Rico's and the territory's problems. I think that Fede will touch on this. There's also broader issues. But I always say that if you were to look at the territories, you're looking at a critical patient in terms of poverty, because really the rates are critically high. And the first step would be using the tools that you have available to treat the patient, which is a robust safety net for the country as a whole that is not covering these territories. And so the first step is extending the full benefits of the safety net to the territories, just as step one, so that then you can address other systemic issues that also affect the territories.
Thank you, Javier. So Federico, let's contextualize this. Why is this happening? Because it seems so far the discussion is that you're a US citizen. If you're in the mainland, you receive certain benefits, but as soon as you're in the territories or reside in Puerto Rico, things change. So help the audience contextualize, why is this happening? What is the background on some of the issues, and anything else you want to comment on?
Sure. Thank you, Doctor, and Javier and Neil. Again, I can't say enough about their hard work in getting a lot of these things through Congress, the CTC, the ITC. We're still fighting, obviously, on SSI and Medicaid parity. And look, I'll be very objective about this. The reason that some of these disparities are happening, you can blame, the broad word of colonialism, but if you dig a little deeper into it, when the United States expanded to the West and eventually conquered Hawaii and Alaska, there were no distinctions between territories. They were all included in the American fabric, meaning in taxes, and eventually they all became states. When the Spanish-American War came around, well, wait a minute, we have all these brown indigenous people that don't speak English in faraway islands. What are we going to do? The Philippines, Guam, Cuba. And so they decided, look, these are alien races, and this is a Supreme Court talking. This is in Federico de Jesus. These are the insular cases that Neil knows so well and has been fighting against, that basically said these people aren't fit for democracy, and we're not going to tax them. So that's a benefit to them, but that's going to be the excuse not to integrate them into the rest of the federal system. And you can make arguments for why that is fair, unfair. I think objectively speaking, it has some benefits to Puerto Rico, but it creates these inequities that Javier and Neil have described so eloquently. But I do have to say that there are some benefits, and those benefits have been reduced from what they were in a previous era decades ago. And it was basically the lack of federal taxation in Puerto Rico allowed the industrialization of the island. Now, obviously, this is controversial because that also destroyed Puerto Rico's agriculture. Some argue that those federal tax incentives extended the life of colonialism in the island, but they also created jobs. And we saw that when Congress took them away, 100,000 jobs were lost, and a second wave of great migration to the US, many of whom are in the Zoom and UCF, can testify that not just Hurricane Maria created a crisis of migration, but the economic situation. And so the justification that the Biden administration gave, even though they promised to bring SSI to Puerto Rico, is that, look, you guys don't pay federal taxes, and therefore there's a policy justification for treating Puerto Rico unequally. The problem is that after Congress took away tax incentives for Puerto Rico, you have, instead of the best of both worlds, which is what pro-Commonwealth people used to promote in Puerto Rico, now you have the worst of both worlds, because you don't have the tax incentives, you have this inequity in Medicaid, SSI, and these other programs. And so the flexibility that Puerto Rico has is not being fully utilized to the greatest degree. And not all of the inequities come out of a lack of full federal participation in the programs we've discussed. Some of the issues surrounding colonialism is the Jones Act, for example, which does apply equally throughout the United States. But in the territories, the Virgin Islands, for example, is exempt, but it applies fully in Puerto Rico, except for some cruise ships. That Puerto Rico imports 80% of its food, 80%. And after Hurricane Maria, the shipping lines and the distribution were severely disrupted, and there were a lot of hungry people that didn't have food or didn't have water or medical supplies, not just the electricity crisis, right? So the Jones Act makes everything more expensive because it forces Puerto Rico to import everything from the United States from the most expensive shipping, the merchant marine in the world. So that's one example of how colonialism isn't just a lack of full federal funding, but it creates an economic and social inequity where even though Puerto Rico is an island full of green resources, consumers are paying a lot more for food and electricity than they should. So these are just a couple of examples on why self-determination and for Puerto Ricans to finally decide their status would bring about more consistent federal policy to Puerto Rico, regardless of status it chooses. But the problem right now is that whether they're benefits or punishments or neutral, if you want to call it, there's inconsistency. There's an arbitrary nature to how the federal government treats Puerto Rico. And frankly, the territorial clause allows Congress to not only discriminate against Puerto Rico, really treat it at its whim. And after the Promesa law, which basically imposed financial control board in Puerto Rico, the illusion of democracy, of people electing their own government and having a constitution really vanished when you have an unelected group of people that are ruling and can overrule the elected leaders of the island. Now, some people say, well, New York City and Washington, D.C. had federal control boards. There was a monitor in Detroit. All of that is true, but people in Michigan voted in Detroit for the people who imposed that monitor, which was the governor. And in New York, they also voted for the governor and mayor who imposed that board. And in D.C., we have taxation without representation, but we do vote for the president of the United States. In Puerto Rico, none of the above. And so what used to be called colonialism by consent, because Puerto Ricans did vote for Commonwealth and for more autonomy, that's no longer the case after Promesa. So you're having government without consent of the governed. Now, does that mean the statehood is the solution? That's obviously something we could get into a separate panel. There are other alternatives out there. And that's the thorny issue behind all of this. And I think that my colleagues here have been eloquently speaking about the human consequences of all of these inequities that colonialism produces.
Thank you, Federico. So Neil, back to you. And Federico mentioned the insular cases, right? And there's always a discussion about that. Perhaps some in the panel, perhaps some in the audience don't know what is that all about. Can you share a little bit of your knowledge on these insular cases and how they're still used to determine certain issues for Puerto Rico and the territories even to this day?
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree with Federico enough that America has a colonies problem, and it's one that folks living in Puerto Rico and the territories feel firsthand. It's one that Puerto Ricans and other folks from the territories living in the diaspora know and understand. But it's not one that the United States as a whole has really come to grapple with. Before Hurricane Maria, a majority of Americans, or a near majority of Americans, didn't even realize that people born in Puerto Rico were US citizens. If you asked the average American to name how many territories the United States has, you'd probably be lucky to get them to be able to name one. And even in Washington, where these areas have non-voting representation in Congress to educate their fellow members of Congress about these issues, it doesn't get much better. The United States has this almost kind of emotional identity level rejection of the idea that the United States could be a colonial nation. And until it begins to grapple with that, progress on a whole range of these different issues is extraordinarily challenging. And where that all starts from is the insular cases. So as Federico was suggesting, in 1898, when the United States, after the Spanish-American War, acquired Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, they were struck with this question. There's a great book by Professor Imhovar called How to Hide an Empire that poses the question like this: if the United States faced what he called a trilemma, one, could have a Republican form of government, which meant one that followed the Constitution. Two, it could have an empire, or three, it could have white supremacy. And at most, the United States at that time could only have two. And unfortunately, for better or worse, white supremacy was not on the chopping block. That was taken for a given in 1898 by all sides of the debate. And so really it came down to this question of, does the Constitution follow the flag? Does citizenship, the rights and protections guaranteed in the Constitution, the promise of political participation, all the things that our nation was founded upon, does that carry over to these newly acquired territories and the really millions of people who lived in them? These issues came before the Supreme Court in a series of cases, the most prominent of which had to do with oranges being shipped from Puerto Rico to New York and tariff issues associated with that. So on its face, kind of a boring legal issue, but it ended up crafting a legal framework that the court and the other branches of government used as a justification for colonialism on American soil. And in these cases, as Federico suggested, the Supreme Court created a distinction between inventing wholly out of its own head, this distinction between two different classes of territories. One, the territories that the United States had always had, which it called so-called incorporated territories. And it created a new class that constituted Puerto Rico, Guam, and these newly acquired overseas islands and territories that were populated by people who spoke a different language and looked different, which it called so-called unincorporated territories. And you can look doctrinally at the language that the Supreme Court uses of how this was treated in different cases. But ultimately, what this distinction comes down to, as critics like Judge Torreya have noted, is it really came down to the skin color and the language spoken by the people that lived in these areas. At root, these were racist Supreme Court decisions that created a justification for colonialism, for not just a temporary state of a lack of political participation, as had been in the case in the territories leading up to the Spanish-American War, but a perpetual state of political disenfranchisement, a perpetual state of inequality, a perpetual state of second-class status. And that's where we are now, almost 125 years later. Puerto Rico has been part of the United States more than half as long as the United States has had a constitution. I mean, this is a long period of American history where the colonialism that was rejected at America's founding, that was again rejected in the second founding with the Civil War, which had a lot to do with the territories, came to a head. And today, the Supreme Court continues to criticize and narrow these decisions, but they have yet to overrule them. And that has significant consequences when it comes not just to constitutional questions, but to some of the policy questions we've talked about today. Because if you have the Supreme Court saying it's okay to discriminate against Puerto Ricans because they live in an unincorporated territory, that then gives justification for Congress to discriminate against them in other ways. And this has to do with federal benefits. It even has to do with the question of citizenship itself. We're litigating a case in the 10th Circuit right now where the US Department of Justice is arguing that there's actually not even any constitutional right to citizenship in the territories, and that the citizenship enjoyed by people born in Puerto Rico is a mere privilege that Congress, if it so chose, could actually take away, not just prospectively, but even retroactively. And the core, the root of all of these justifications for colonialism on American soil is the Insular cases, which really all three branches of the federal government should reject, and that the Supreme Court will have the opportunity to grapple with this next month. And many organizations and many folks are calling on them to take this opportunity to actually overrule the Insular cases, as the Supreme Court has overruled other racist Supreme Court decisions like Plessy versus Ferguson, which established the justification for racial segregation, or the Korematsu case, which provided justification for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. So this isn't just a historical issue. It's one that impacts the lives of citizens in the territories every day. And more broadly, it impacts every American because it has created this systemic racism and systemic system that allows for colonialism on American soil. And until the United States as a country really grapples with that question, I fear that a lot of these kind of symptoms of that broader problem are going to continue to be perpetuated and be difficult to solve through a political process that citizens in these areas are excluded from.
Thank you, Neil. So Javier, in terms of kind of like policy recommendations, right? And, you know, while we wait for this, you know, court decisions and all type of other issues, what are some of the things that you're recommending in terms of the work that you do and sort of the recommendations that could be specific to the issues that we're talking about here today?
Yeah, I think just piggybacking on what Neil and Rico were saying, I think talking about colonialism and the disparities, the programmatic manifestation of that is, again, an unbelievably convoluted federal net over the territories. I started looking at the safety net 3 years ago, and you know, you hear about the territories being excluded from all these big programs, but when you start looking at how they're excluded and how each program arbitrarily provides access to some territories, others not. For example, just in the case of SNAP, you have 2 territories, USVI and Guam, that have access to the program, and 3 others that don't. Medicaid excludes all the territories fully. In the credits, you have a distinction between non-mirror code and mirror code territories. It gets convoluted quickly. And in looking at this, you start realizing how legally and programmatically the federal government has instituted an unbelievably convoluted system that makes it really hard actually to fight against the disparities and the inequities. Because really you need time to understand what the gaps are. You need time to explain what they are, and then you need time to actually bridge the gaps, and it's not easy. You know, transitioning into any of these programs, you know, be it Medicaid or SNAP, these are things that take time. It could take, you know, anywhere from 5 to 10 years. They're big programs, are complicated. And the fact that we haven't been participating fully in any of them means that we haven't been creating the knowledge, we haven't been training the personnel that we need, we haven't been building the systems that we need to participate in them. So it's also, I just want to let people know, it's not like you turn on a switch and you say, we have full access to a program and that's it. These things take time. And I think that's also the manifestation of the disparities that Rico and Neil were talking about. And of course, the human toll of this is, again, incredibly high poverty rates and also out-migration. You know, in Puerto Rico alone, you have had more than 500,000 people leave the island in the last 10 years or so, which is by far the largest outmigration train that the US has seen in the last 10, 15 years. It's enormous. So in terms of policy recommendations, I think, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think the first step is closing all the gaps that we have with the safety net. There's no reason for there to be any gaps in the safety net. And going back to something that Rico said before, I wanted to clarify that while it is true that the territories don't pay, for example, an income federal tax, the territories do pay a whole host of federal taxes. And a lot of these programs actually take it, for example, the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. They were designed to offset not the income tax, but payroll taxes. And those are paid in full in all 5 territories. So there's this argument out there that the territories shouldn't have access to these programs because we don't pay for them, because we don't pay federal taxes. But that is, that is not true. We pay all federal taxes except the income tax, and most safety net programs are programs that are offset by all the other taxes except that one. So we should have full access to them. And also, it should be pointed out that many of the people that would qualify for these programs are people that wouldn't pay the federal income tax anyways, because their incomes are too low to even qualify for a federal income tax. So again, in terms of policy recommendations, I think that we need to close all the gaps in the safety net. I think it's a basic human right. It's a point of dignity. We're not talking about giving free money to the wealthy people in the territories. We're trying to help the people that need the money the most in the territories, which is an incredibly big population of low-income families that happen to be concentrated in these places. And so again, I think the first step to treating that would be to provide access to the safety net that's available in the US. It's not a perfect safety net. It could be better. At the center, we also focus on improving it at a national level. But the territories are 2 steps behind. We don't have access to the poor safety net that's available to the nation as a whole. And we don't even have access to all the other programs that would be available. So we're lagging behind big time. And so I think it's high time that we close these gaps. And I think from a policy perspective, it makes all the sense in the world. As Neil was saying, these are issues that affect not only people in the territories, but also the country as a whole. Because at the end of the day, what happens is that you have, massive outmigration going into the states. And I think what we should try to do is create living conditions for people to be able to live in these territories, which the US also likes to say are very much a part of the country.
Thank you, Javier. And I like your comment. Sometimes I get the impression, right, from the general public that you can just turn on a switch, right, and these things go away. And that goes into my question, Federico. So every time, the number one question I get from people, why is Puerto Rico not a state? And if they're a state, all these things will magically disappear. So if you can comment on that, or anything that Neil and Javier have said so far.
Sure, and I would add to what Javier said on taxes, which is completely true, that Puerto Rico, the residents don't pay federal income taxes on Puerto Rico sourced income. But if you're a resident of Puerto Rico and you have a company, an investment, a pension in another country, the United States or France or wherever, you have to pay federal income taxes on that income. You're only exempt from Puerto Rico sourced income, which means income generated in the island. In Puerto Rico, Javier mentioned mirror tax jurisdictions. Basically, unlike other territories, Puerto Rico is the only place on earth where you can go as a US citizen and not pay federal income taxes. The other territories have this thing called the mirror code, which is basically the IRS code applying to the territories. And like in Palestine, the federal government basically charges IRS, and they don't have their own local fiscal autonomy that I would argue Puerto Rico used to have before the Federal Control Board. But why isn't it? That's a great question. And obviously, if you have 10 Puerto Ricans in a room, you'll have 30 different answers. So I'll take a crack at mine. I think that underlying all of this discussion is that the fact that Puerto Rico is sociologically a nation, a country, just like Palestine is a nation, but isn't independent, or Scotland or Catalonia. Puerto Rico has its own identity. And that comes with cultural differences, language differences. And so these safety net programs are essential, but we also need job creation, and we need job creation targeted into Puerto Rican reality. Some people point to Hurricane Maria as to the disparities how the federal government treats Puerto Rico, but some disparities are needed. And I'm not talking about disparities more as unique treatment. For example, FEMA is structured in a way where the federal government supports the state for the state to provide support for local governments. That's how FEMA works. But in the case of Puerto Rico, the entire island was cut off, not just because of electricity, lack of telecommunications. You didn't have a local government structure. And so people were very frustrated that FEMA wasn't distributing water or food. And they said, well, that's not our job. That's what the local government is for. But in the case of Puerto Rico, there was no local government to speak for, right? So part of the reason Puerto Rico isn't a state, it's because it's not like a state. And Puerto Ricans, most of them don't even consider themselves Americans. They'll tell you they're US citizens, but that's kind of different. And so we've had 6 non-binding referenda in Puerto Rico. Some would argue that the last 3 produced victories for statehood, but Congress wasn't forced to do anything about them. And in the last 2, the US Department of Justice rejected those plebiscites because they excluded other options. And so unless Puerto Ricans can sit down in a process that's fair and inclusive, where all sides participate equally, then we're just going to keep fighting amongst ourselves, and Congress has no incentive to solve the problem for us, right? And so it's this chicken and an egg thing where the empire says, well, you guys should get together and decide. And then we vote, and they say, well, that was inconclusive. You need to do it all over again. And then we say, well, tell us what you're for. Well, we're not really in the mood. And it's this back and forth that Puerto Rico has suffered for the last 123 years. Now, Puerto Ricans did come together in the 50s to forge a constitution that was ratified by 83% of the people and the United States Congress. The United States went to the United Nations and said that Puerto Rico had reached a level of self-governance and autonomy that merited taking it away from the list of non-self-governing territories. And it told basically the world that if this wasn't a compact, which was stronger than a treaty, that's what the United States told the United Nations, then this would be a monumental hoax. And fast forward to 2016, and what happened? Congress took away that limited form of autonomy. And Puerto Rico now is like Washington, D.C., at the mercy of the federal government. But unlike Washington, D.C., where they do pay federal income taxes and where it is the capital of the nation and where 90% of voted for statehood because we're disenfranchised tax-paying US citizens, D.C. doesn't have its own national Olympic team. D.C. doesn't have its own tax system. D.C. doesn't have its own. And you mentioned, and I'll end here, does statehood solve all of these colonial problems? Well, it does solve the undemocratic nature of the relationship because you would get to vote for president and members of Congress. But there's other side effects of colonialism, like I mentioned, the Jones Act. The reason that I'm wearing this hat, by the way, it's a Vieques hat. It's a small island off the coast of Puerto Rico where the US Navy used to bomb for 60 years until they killed an outpost officer in the target range. And we discovered that Vieques had higher incidences of cancer and other diseases because the US Navy used radioactive and chemicals, and they tested it on the people on the ground there. So there are a lot of side effects of colonialism. Guam knows what the US military industrial complex is all about and how it can harm the local population and its environment. So I think that you should take a look at Puerto Rico's unique circumstances, and really democracy should win. But we're not a state because I would argue that we haven't had a fair process to bring that about. If Puerto Ricans overwhelmingly wanted it and we were united, I think Congress would have a harder time denying it. But since we are so divided and we really don't know what we want, Congress really hasn't had any desire to solve the colonial problem. We are in this limbo that's called an unincorporated territory, formerly a Commonwealth.
And if I could just add on top of that, I think Federico touches on a critical dynamic that's going on here of the divide and conquer strategy, which is a divide and conquer strategy, not just within one territory like Puerto Rico, but even between the territories. And this is something that Javier kind of alluded to in some of these benefits programs, where while they're each treated a little bit differently, and some people might say, oh, well, that's great. Each territory is unique. They should have unique policies that are really tailored to each of them. But what it ends up doing is it ends up kind of breaking them up from being able to act in solidarity together. And this emphasis on disagreement within territories or between them as an excuse for inaction by the federal government, I think really hides what ultimately is a much broader consensus that exists, again, between territories and even within particular territories. I think there's broad agreement on things like if Puerto Ricans are to be US citizens, they should be able to participate in the same federal benefits programs that other US citizens take for granted, that there should be either meaningful political participation in the federal government or meaningful autonomy separate and apart from the rules that Congress passes. So there actually is, in my view, and some polling that's beginning to be done actually supports this, that there actually is a lot more consensus that meets the eye on a broad range of issues. And I think that's only grown in the last few years after Hurricane Maria. But if you were to watch a congressional hearing on many Puerto Rican issues, you would completely miss that, because oftentimes Congress emphasizes and the federal government emphasizes this kind of disagreement that is perceived to exist, and then uses that as an excuse for throwing up their hands and saying, oh, well, you know, I guess we can't do anything. When ultimately, on a broad range of these issues, I think the source that needs to feel ownership of this is the federal government itself, is the United States. America has a colonies problem. Puerto Rico suffers from it. Guam suffers from it. But the problem is one that the United States itself has created and has an obligation itself to solve. And so regardless whether there are differing viewpoints, it's a complicated issue, the United States can't use that as an excuse to do nothing. It must engage further and recognize the ownership it itself has for causing the problem as a way to find a path forward and to have a serious national conversation around these issues. And that's the kind of platform that cases like Valle Madero can really present. You know, these Supreme Court cases that are going to be written about in the New York Times and, you know, the national media, that give a chance to tell the story, both of the individuals who are being impacted by this discrimination, but also the broader story of America's colonies problem and how the United States itself has a responsibility to solve it and can't simply wash its hands by saying, oh, well, folks in Puerto Rico or the other territories aren't all on the same page. That's never been an excuse for injustice, and it shouldn't be an excuse for continued injustice here.
So I'm going to pose one last question before we take questions for the audience. So thank you so much for kind of contextualizing, putting the issues at hand. So for the viewers, and you know, what they can do to help or address some of these things, and you know, what might be some practical implications of what they need to do.
Can I take a crack at that? Sure. So Neil mentioned the broad growing consensus on a lot of Puerto Rico and other territorial issues like parity on safety net programs. After Hurricane Maria, we realized so many people, because they don't participate in the SNAP program, suffered hunger in the United States under the United States flag. And so those issues are important. And right now we have a window with a Democratic Congress and a president that promised parity on these issues to lobby and call people in Congress and say, we want you to pass President Biden's parity agenda for Puerto Rico. We want you to pass job creation programs for Puerto Rico, whether that's tax incentives, investments in green infrastructure, or otherwise. And if you believe in statehood, lobby Congress for it. If you believe in self-determination and other options, lobby Congress for that bill. But make sure your voice is heard, and make sure that you don't just vote every 2 years or every 4 years, but that you hold your leaders accountable, right? Many of us, and I'll be blunt, supported President Biden, but we are holding him accountable because he did promise to bring SSI and Medicaid to Puerto Rico, and he's not fulfilling his promise. And we also need Congress to step up. And so we do have an opportunity here. It's not just bad news. There's a lot of things that can get done. The CTC and ITC were big victories. And I think that there's broad consensus over the Jones Act, for example, Puerto Rico. The Jones Act is meant to protect US industry, but what winds up happening is Puerto Rico, because of the Jones Act, instead of buying natural gas or other products from the States, we actually get it from Trinidad, Tobago and Russia. So it's not benefiting Puerto Rican consumers, it's hurting American industry, right? Because that natural gas coming out of Louisiana or Texas could go to Puerto Rico. Or if you believe in solar, why are we even importing all of this to Puerto Rico through that stupid law that also impacts other territories? So there's a lot that people can do. I think that Hurricane Maria and frankly, the Ricky Renuncia movement in 2019 when we kicked governor. We all galvanized together. Vieques is another example of where we came together for the health and benefit of our compatriots. And I think we should also realize that we have allies. There's a lot of organizations, Latino, Puerto Rican, or otherwise, that have made solidarity with Puerto Rico an essential part of their political agenda, and we need to take advantage of that before that window closes. So I think there's good news and opportunity for especially the diaspora to get engaged, and for folks on these islands, not just Puerto Rico. Remember, you have relatives and allies in the States who have voting representation, who can be your best advocates. So if you're in the island and you feel powerless, contact your friends and relatives in Florida and Texas and North Carolina and New Jersey and Philadelphia and tell them, look, we need help. We need SSI. We need Biden to fulfill his promise. Tell Congress to do what Biden promised, and that's why we voted for him. If you did, and if we didn't, he's still your president and needs to deliver. And I think that's a message that could resonate with people from across party lines in the diaspora.
Thank you, Federico. Javier, any insights you want to?
I have to just echo Fed on this one. I think civic duty is the best you can do, whether you're in Puerto Rico or in the States. Especially if you're anywhere on the East Coast, chances are that you're going to be part of a substantial community of Puerto Ricans. We have an incredibly big presence. And so, you know, anything you can do to press your Congress members, your representatives, to let them know that you care about these issues, that Puerto Rico should be a big item on their agenda, really helps, because when they come to DC, they're paying closer attention to Puerto Rico. And if you're in Puerto Rico, again, civic duty is key to hold leaders accountable locally. Oftentimes, you know, it happens that we don't have the best elected leaders in Puerto Rico and we shoot ourselves in the foot. Those leaders eventually make it all the way to DC, and they also have a big voice, right? And so if they're not fighting for these very basic things, it makes it really hard. I think, you know, in DC at least, the lack of representation that Neil and Fede have been talking about, and this is true for all the territories, means that we don't have elected officials, we have very little leverage. And so the biggest leverage we have is our voice, really. So the louder we can be, the more intensive our civic duty can be to push all these leaders to fight for Puerto Rico. Many leaders who don't necessarily come from Puerto Rico or don't have a personal connection, but might have a big population of Puerto Ricans in their state or their district, you need to make them care. And the way to make them care is to let them know that you know, we're a big community and we have big needs as well. And I think that push is essential. I know it sounds basic, but it really is the key. It's the one tool that we have at our disposal.
Neil,
I would just add to that and even emphasize more the importance of showing up to have your voice be heard. That elected officials, you know, they can be influenced by social media, by emails, by letters, but ultimately nothing says that change is demanded more than people showing up with their bodies. And we've seen the power of that in Puerto Rico, whether it's after Hurricane Maria, with people coming together, rallying together to help their fellow Puerto Ricans, or most starkly, as Federico mentioned, with the Ricky Renuncia movement. I mean, literally hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million Puerto Ricans coming together with their bodies to demand change. And despite a lot of dynamics against that change, they were successful. I think if the energy of Puerto Ricans can be channeled to address some of these systemic issues and some of this you know, long-term discrimination, that there can really be a lot of movement on these issues politically. I think an example of this is where folks haven't shown up, though, is when it comes to the Supreme Court. So there's been a number of big Supreme Court cases over the last few years involving Puerto Rico and the territories. And I've gone to most of those arguments. And when I go, it's great. I love seeing my Puerto Rican friends who, you know, attorneys who show up, maybe filed amicus briefs. It's a lot of fun. But what I don't see is a mobilization along the lines of what you see when there's a Supreme Court case about gun rights or abortion or about unions, where there's hundreds, if not thousands, of people in front of the Supreme Court demanding not just that the Supreme Court do the right thing, but that Congress across the street also act to address their issues. And that has not happened to date when it comes to issues that Puerto Ricans face. And so November 9th will be an opportunity again for Puerto Ricans to have their voice be heard, to use their bodies to show that. And it doesn't just have to be in Washington, D.C. It could be in Puerto Rico, holding local elected officials accountable, holding federal officials there accountable. It could be in Florida, where 1 million Puerto Ricans live who can vote, who have not yet become the political force that they could be. And that issues like this really could be an opportunity to galvanize the community, to come around with one political voice to say, we actually demand congressional action on these issues. And if you don't act, particularly when you have the opportunity to, there's going to be political consequences. And so that's one thing that's, I'm primarily a lawyer, but I dabble in politics, and I just don't understand what the Biden administration or Democratic leaders in Congress are thinking when it appears that they're not going to be including many of these programs in the upcoming, several $1 trillion Build Back Better reconciliation process. What are they going to tell Puerto Rican voters in Florida when they had the opportunity to act to extend SSI to suffering family members in Puerto Rico, but they chose not to? I think Puerto Ricans will have a lot of questions for candidates in Florida in the coming years about, what did you do when you had the opportunity to act? What did you do to deliver on the political promises you made us in the last election? And I think some of this, again, is kind of a vestige of colonialism, where Puerto Ricans have been politically disempowered for so long that it's not really a natural muscle for them to use to say, oh, wait a minute, we're a politically powerful constituency. We actually can get what we want if the diaspora speaks in one voice or acts together. They've been marginalized for so long that this isn't something that necessarily comes naturally to operating in national politics in this way. And I think through the work of a lot of organizations, FEDE works with a number of them, that's starting to change. And in my view, it can't change soon enough, because until there are political consequences for breaking promises to Puerto Rican voters, and that comes on, from both political parties, I don't think that either political party is going to act the way that they should when it comes to addressing these longstanding issues.
Thank you so much. So I'm gonna turn it over to some of the questions, and our good friend Dennis Freites has a lengthy post out here that you can look at the chat. So I just want to acknowledge you, Dennis. I hope you're doing well. But I'm going to go with the question that Rick Colon posted out here. Federico mentioned the Jones Act, and I'm curious to know, recently Puerto Rico has been growing more now than previously its own food and participating in a conference such as AgroHack, a conference that brings to light the growing number of young chefs and coffee farm growers. Can Puerto Rico have enough in this sector to help cut in the import of food, or does the Jones Act prevent us from doing so?
Look, that's a great question, and I'm going to paste a link from the Miami Herald. This is the link in English, but in Spanish, but the Miami Herald translates, so you can look it up. Puerto Rico has a food sovereignty movement. It's called agroecology. And basically, there is a way. In this article, scientists argue that Puerto Rico could substitute, instead of 80% importing food right now, we could actually import a third only of the food consumed in Puerto Rico. And it's harder than it seems, but people are actually doing it. After Hurricane Maria, there wasn't a choice. I went to Ay Bonito, to that agroecological cooperative that's mentioned in the article, and they do a great job, but it's obviously something that, to be able to be replicated, you can't have tax incentives from Monsanto in Puerto Rico instead of actually supporting ecologically friendly small farmers in the island. So I urge you to consider that article and the science there. And the Jones Act is another example Javier and Neil were talking about, because it doesn't apply equally to the territories. Puerto Rico is saddled with the Jones Act fully, and again, except for a very minor cruise ship provision between islands in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. But there are jurisdictions in the Pacific that are exempt from the Maritime Jones Act, but they're still subject to the air cabotage laws. And again, the Virgin Islands are completely exempt. And that makes things a lot more expensive. Puerto Rico used to have something called Las Navieras, which was literally a state-owned company to reduce those costs. And it was under the US flag, but guess what? It was privatized and that doesn't work. So right now, Puerto Rico has a criminal duopoly. And I say criminal because the two companies pleaded guilty to colluding to artificially raise prices. And these are the shipping companies that you can look up. I'm not going to shame them by name, but you all know who I'm talking about. And so, yes, there are a lot of things that Puerto Rico can do. But again, if Puerto Rico is subject to the Jones Act, whether it's a federal administrative waiver, because I don't think Congress has the will to actually repeal or exempt anybody from the law, but the president has the authority to do it by executive order. And that's what we should be pushing for. But again, crop substitution and agroecological sustainable farm crops are a reality in Puerto Rico. We just need to get them up to scale, and I encourage you to read the article that I just posted. Thank you.
Thank you, Federico. And if you have any questions for the audience, make sure to put it on the chat. So Lisa Porter, how has COVID-19 affected Puerto Rico? And did the US provide any of the aid to Puerto Ricans that was given to the mainland citizens?
I'm happy to take a crack at that one. I would say, for the most part, the aid, the first aid that's been given to the rest of the country has been provided to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has received big allotments to shore up the NAP aid it provides, which is food stamps. When it comes to Medicaid, Puerto Rico did receive substantial boosts in Medicaid help. There's something called the FMAP, which is the matching rate, and it was increased substantially in Puerto Rico as well through the emergency. But taking a step back, I think the big problem with COVID, and this was so different from the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, was that after Hurricane Maria, the economy was incredibly devastated, just as it was by the pandemic. But the big difference in dynamics was that after Hurricane Maria, a lot of Puerto Ricans were able to pack their bags and leave and go to the mainland to escape sort of the severe conditions in Puerto Rico. But with the pandemic, it's been different because the pandemic has affected every place, right? So there was nowhere to go. And so I think the rise and the huge spike in unemployment that we saw in Puerto Rico was incredibly severe. And where I think that the federal government failed was, again, in acknowledging that, as with the safety net, Puerto Rico is 2 steps behind when it comes to employment conditions. For example, the unemployment rate is critically high in Puerto Rico, much higher than what it is in the rest of the country. And so many of the helps that were provided to Puerto Rico were only provided in function of what was given to the rest of the country, as opposed to recognizing that Puerto Rico would have needed special treatment because conditions are so much more severe there. And I think that what I would have liked to see in many of the packages were special carve-outs for Puerto Rico and the territories that recognize that COVID-19 came at a time where territories have been through so much, right? As opposed to the rest of the country, the territories have been through natural disasters. You have typhoons in the Pacific, you have massive hurricanes in the east. You have an economic recession in Puerto Rico that's been ongoing for 15 plus years, outmigration. These are conditions that have not been happening on the mainland, but have been happening in Puerto Rico on the territories. And so I think that the package should have acknowledged that, one, now we're dealing with a pandemic on top of all these other conditions. And so the packages should have acknowledged that we needed more help than the rest of the country. We did see a little bit of that in some pools of funding. For example, the state emergency funds that were provided to the territories was slightly higher proportionally than what was given to the rest of the country. That's something that at the center we worked really hard, and we got some allotments that fully recognized that Puerto Rico and the territories needed proportionally more money, precisely because conditions were already so bad even before the pandemic hit. But again, there's a lot to be done, and I think that the packages fell short as usual. I would also add that one of the big boosts that we got through COVID-19 was the American Rescue Plan. COVID-19 sort of provided the conditions for that plan to be approved. And as I mentioned before, in that plan, we did get 2 permanent pieces of legislation that provide full access to the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. And that has nothing to do with COVID-19, but we were able to frame it as an adequate response to the pandemic. And now we have those permanently in the territory. So I think that was a big win, just to give you some positive lights and not make it so grim.
And I just echo on that a little bit. I mean, I think one thing that, you know, COVID-19 benefits that the territories received, they were life-saving as they were everywhere. But they also highlighted the deficiencies that existed in these areas, as you said, in the absence of that. So it's kind of bringing the territories up to a more equal treatment. And then now the challenge faced when there's a cliff where those benefits trail off or end, and it's back to the old treatment of inequality that then has a compounding effect. I think the other thing it revealed, and this speaks a little bit to the broader kind of questions of some of the fiscal challenges that Puerto Rico faces, particularly with respect to its debt, is just what is the compounding impact of the denial of equality in federal programs over the years. And what's kind of interesting, if you do the math, and I think they're not entirely correlated, but if you do the math and add up how much money the federal government should have sent to Puerto Rico through these federal programs over the years, the number actually comes eerily close to the overall amount of Puerto Rico's debt. And in a certain way, that actually makes sense. So, you know, if the federal government isn't covering Medicaid and healthcare the same way that it does in the states, that means that the Puerto Rico government has to borrow more money to fill that gap. If citizens aren't receiving SSI benefits in Puerto Rico, the government of Puerto Rico needs to meet those needs in other ways. And so basically kind of taking out the charge card in order to establish and meet some of those deficiencies that have been met by the federal government. And so again, all these issues are related and come back to the ultimate question of the relationship between the people in these territories and the federal government. What does it mean to be a US citizen today? What responsibility does the United States to have to provide for all of its citizens, regardless where they live? And how does this all fit into broader questions of self-determination and the future relationship of these areas to the United States? None of these are easy answers, but I would argue that the United States has a moral responsibility to address them. Not just because they're life and death issues for people today in the territories, but because if we don't do anything different, we're going to be having these same conversations 5, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years down the future. And I would posit that 123 years of colonialism and unequal treatment in the United States is 123 years too long.
Thank you, Neil. And actually, there's a question for Denise Freitas, and it's for you, Neil. Can statutory U.S. citizens residing in the states lose their non-permanent U.S. citizenship per Tuana versus U.S. 2016 presidential reports?
Yeah, the federal government's legal position, I think, is pretty clear that they do not view the territories, unincorporated territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, as being part of the United States for purposes of the citizenship clause. And so if what the 14th Amendment citizenship clause says, if you're born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, you have a right to be a US citizen. Basically, if you're born on US soil, you have a right to citizenship. And the federal government's view, which began again in 1898 after acquiring these new areas, is that, well, we can treat these areas as being part of the United States for certain constitutional purposes, but not for others, really kind of at the whim of Congress. And the consequence of that as a legal matter, if you take the federal government's position seriously, which I think people should, is that Congress actually could tomorrow come in and say, Federico, born in Puerto Rico, been great having you as a citizen, thanks, but now we don't want you to be a citizen even more, even though you've been living stateside for decades. And that's that's the legal conclusion that follows from the federal government's position, which is why current and former elected officials in the territories have stood up in these cases about birthright citizenship to say no. Separate and apart from these status questions, if you're born on U.S. soil, you have a right to citizenship under the Constitution. We've worked to bring together former elected officials, including former Governor Pedro Rosselló, former Governor Aníbal Acevedo Vilá, former Governor Fortunio, to stand together in support of this issue, which again, I think demonstrates how there actually is a lot more consensus and agreement on certain issues than meets the eyes. And you can actually bring together folks to work together on these things. But these issues are going to be litigated in the coming weeks and months, and hopefully the Supreme Court will have an opportunity to address them soon. And we'll maybe finally get an answer to what is the status, what's the right to citizenship of people in Puerto Rico and other territories, a question that the Supreme Court initially had before it in 1904 in a case Gonzalez versus Williams. And it didn't answer the question there, it punted, and that inaction by the Supreme Court has led in part to the question marks that has surrounded these issues for the past century.
Federico, you have your
Yeah, Neil and I have talked about this privately, so he's not surprised that I disagree with him on this citizenship issue. Number one, according to the Immigration Naturalization Act of, I think it's 1946, Puerto Ricans are deemed to have been born in the US. And there's another case not related to Puerto Rico called Afroyim versus Rusk. It's really hard for the US government to strip citizenship away unless you prove very specific treasonous acts that are very difficult to prove. And thus far, nobody has accused a Puerto Rican of being a different type of citizenship. I would argue that discrimination against Puerto Rico is geographically national origin based. But if Joe Biden moves to Puerto Rico, he loses the right to vote for himself in the next election. And so is the issue that we have different citizenship or that we live in a place that is a colony of the United States? When I moved to DC, I got to vote for president and I also got to pay federal income taxes for the first time. And so that holds the same for someone who moves to the island. Whether Congress can pass a law saying that from October 30th on, Puerto Rican people born in Puerto Rico will no longer be natural born citizens, of course they have the right to do that. However, I could pass the citizenship on my children if I wanted to for 2 generations. So I think those are questions that, as Neil said, haven't been addressed by the court. I think it's not as clear cut that Congress has the power to take away citizenship. I think it would be very hard, if not impossible, but that's my view.
Yeah, under existing precedent, there is like the Afroyim case that involves citizenship people born or naturalized in the United States. There are actually other Supreme Court cases where they've said that a lot of those protections don't apply to people who acquire citizenship not through birth or naturalization in the United States. And so those are the cases that really raise cause for concern about the retroactivity. Serious legal scholars have looked at these questions and raised that there are problems. I ultimately would agree with you, Federico, that I think that precedent itself is problematic. And it just highlights the importance of having an answer to this constitutional question of what does citizenship mean for people born in Puerto Rico and other territories. And I think that's the issue that it would be really helpful to have resolved by the Supreme Court as soon as possible.
So I think we're gonna have, if anybody from the audience has another question, let me know, but I will ask one myself. Federico, you mentioned the issue of local governance in Puerto Rico, right? And we kind of like talk, what can the diaspora do here to sort of shift those type of things, but what can people in Puerto Rico do as well to kind of like pinpoint these issues as well?
Well, look, I think that part of the lessons that we learned in 2019 in the diaspora regarding the Rico y Renuncia movement was that after the hurricane, we focused, or a lot of us focused on the Trump administration, their insults, their disparate treatment in terms of the recovery and other issues. But we kind of, ignored or swept the rug the corruption and inefficiency of the Puerto Rican government. And so, for example, Puerto Rico has access to a lot of billions of dollars to rebuild the island. We're having power outages in the island in the last several months, even though there's a new private operator for the transmission and distribution. But the private utility, the public utility, PREPA, has still not presented FEMA plan to rebuild the grid and therefore get $13 billion in exchange. And Puerto Rico has a great law that mandates 100% renewable energy by 2050. Will that money be used according to Puerto Rican law, or will it be used according to President Biden's climate goals? That's something that Puerto Ricans in the island should pressure their governor and their legislature to continue to do. And they should also pressure the government to have more transparency and community participation in how to distribute the money the Congress allocated to Puerto Rico, which the government has been very, very slow and ineffective in distributing. The Biden administration took away Trump-era restrictions on how to use the money. And so it's going to be increasingly more difficult for the government to justify why they're not spending it. Now, that's something that the citizens in the island should pressure their government to do, but there are also economic realities. Puerto Rico, because of its colonial relationship and the loss of tax incentives, the migration, we have a situation where only 40% of the people who are able to work. So 60% of Puerto Ricans aren't in the formal economy. Does that mean? No, a lot of them have jobs that they're called so-called underground economy jobs. But right now, to rebuild Puerto Rico, the government itself has said there's a shortage of 20,000 workers. Now, it may be because those jobs don't pay enough. It may be because a lot of those workers move to the States, or it may be because people on the island don't want to do those jobs, or we don't control our own immigration system and can bring Haitians and Dominicans or other Central Americans, even though there's a trickle of them. We've actually had to bring in Dominicans to grow coffee in the island. And so the disparate treatment of Puerto Rico affects all of these things that, again, across the board, equal treatment on everything doesn't solve a lot of these problems. And so we should look at our own government to hold them accountable so that the money we have in our pockets is actually spent in the right way and according to community participation and not just the whims of politicians, frankly. And in the case of Puerto Rico, the governor only got 33% of the vote. So it's not like he has a mandate and there's an opposition legislature. So unless Puerto Ricans really work together to hold whichever administration is in power in the island, and not just to do the normal things that we expect the government to do, but also, like Javier said, the governor of Puerto Rico and the resident commissioner are the highest ranking elected officials from the island, and their voice in DC matters. So if the governor or the resident commissioner aren't pushing for parity on Medicaid, for example, which is something we saw last summer, then it's going to be really hard for diaspora advocates to say, well, we know better than the government. And so we need to hold them accountable for their federal policies as well. Javier can speak more to that, but it's very hard to lobby Congress for these issues when you have the government of Puerto Rico often not necessarily singing the same tune and not fighting hard enough for equality on the things that they need to, or fighting hard enough for Puerto Ricans to be treated justly, like Javier mentioned earlier.
Javier, I don't know if you want to add something else into the question.
No, I think Fede covered it really, really well. Yeah, no, I think I agree with him. We need a healthy dose of civic duty in Puerto Rico to push for better leadership. We've certainly had a crisis of it in the past couple of years. And again, as I said, you know, these leaders do end up going to Washington, D.C., and they set up the agenda for a lot of us. You know, especially for those of us working in nonprofits that are not Puerto Rican themselves, we always defer to Puerto Rican organizations or the government. And so we don't have effective leadership that's coming from the island. It's really hard for us then to really push for the things that matter in Congress. So that leadership is key. Like Fede was saying, for example, the lack of consensus or the lack of energy behind pushing for Medicaid parity or SSI parity even. If that's not coming from Puerto Rico's government, it's really hard then to rally the troops in DC to push others to do it, because the question that we get in Congress is always, where is your government? Why aren't they asking for this? And so in order to not get that question, we need them to be on the same page. And that requires good leadership, effective leadership.
Neil, I don't know if you want to add your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that, you know, out of college, I worked in Congress for Guam's non-voting delegate to Congress for a number of years, and really saw just the challenges of the political process generally for communities that are disenfranchised. It's one of the things that made me want to go to law school and use litigation as a tool for change, where at least in theory, there's a more level playing field. But yeah, absolutely, it's important to have our elected officials in the territory standing up for full application of these benefits, and when they don't, it's kind of hard to then point the finger at Congress or the president for not following through. But even then, ultimately, it's going to be the president and I think Democratic leadership that are going to face these political consequences, particularly with Puerto Rican voters in Florida. And so, they made these promises, and regardless what they hear from elected officials in Puerto Rico, I think that voters in Florida are going to demand that they follow through on those promises.
I want to acknowledge Jimmy Torres Vela's comment that ask all your friends that lives in the United States to register and vote. Regardless if you're Puerto Rican or not, make sure that you participate in the electoral process, which it's sometimes even at the local level. We need to make sure that we have that representation as well. So we have about 8 minutes or so left, and so kind of like from the last question, right? In terms, so how do we align the priorities, right? Why is this? It seems that there's like sometimes a mixed match between the priorities of the Puerto Rican government and kind of like the priorities at the federal level out here, and what might be some things that we can do differently to make sure that they're aligned correctly, and there's more sort of a push, and people at the federal level and even locally start recognizing that and kind of like push for change.
I mean, I guess I'll start, and then would love to hear more from my co-panelists on this. I mean, I think one challenge that folks in the territories face is just, based on distance, based on a number of factors, there's not perhaps a level of engagement or understanding of politics in DC and how, kind of how the sausage gets made, which then kind of, I think, leads some folks to think, oh, well, we can, let's work to address these issues this year, but we can always try to address them next year. And I think what people need to realize is that there's a historic political moment of opportunity right now with a Democratic president who's made these promises and Democratic leadership in Congress that has embraced them to deliver on some longstanding policy issues impacting residents of the territories, and that likely, next year, that political window is going to close. And so there is this short time period where lots of change can happen to benefit residents of the territories that we may never see again in the next decade. Politically, these stars only align so often. And when they do, particularly when there are spending bills being discussed like there are today, those opportunities need to be taken advantage of. And that's where voters in the territories need to push their own elected officials to say, now is the moment. We got to do a full press to get resolution to these issues now, not next year, not the year after that, but now, because there's not going to be a political window in the future. And I think it's a little bit hard for folks to fully embrace or understand that, being so far from Washington, D.C., not having the kinds of interactions that maybe other communities do, with seeing how kind of the political sausage in Washington gets made, which stems from the colonialism and lack of historic political participation. But this is a historic moment now, and everyone needs to act with that urgency, because it's going to pass us before we know it.
Javier, Federico, any reactions?
I think I'm just going to agree with Neil on this one. I think a lot about this question, especially for Puerto Ricans on the mainland versus the Puerto Ricans on the island. And, contexts are different, circumstances are different. If you're in New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, Florida, right, your issues might be a little different than the ones you face when you're on the island. So I often wonder what it is that we need to bridge all of us together, what it is that we need to connect. And of course, identity is huge. And I think this goes back to what Federico was saying, is that we truly we're a nation of people. And I think also the reminder that a lot of us live on the mainland because we have to live there, but not necessarily because we want to be there. We would love to be able to live in Puerto Rico. And the reason that we don't live there is because we don't have the necessary living conditions to do so. And I know that Fede and I have had plenty of conversations about this. So I think that if that is enough, to make you care, right? If that is enough, whether you are, you know, in any part of the US, to know that if you fight for things that matter in Puerto Rico and the territories really, to make things better back home, it is a possibility then, maybe not for yourself, but for others to be able to go back. Because so many people have left, really, so many people have left. 500,000 people have left in the last 10 years, right? That didn't want to go, but had to because living conditions are not where they should be. And so to the extent that we can push the federal government to provide the resources, the programs, the access to the programs to make living conditions better back home, it does slide things towards a more positive light in which, you know, ideally we could go back home. And I think to me, that's really what binds everything together. But it is sort of an intangible thing. And I think it goes back to what Federico was saying, we really are a nation of people. And we like home, we care about home.
Federico and Dwayne? Yeah.
We don't have a lot, so I'll try to sum up. I think that in terms of your question, what are the priorities? We've talked about them. We've talked about what people should be advocating for: parity in social safety net, job creation, and self-determination. And I think that those are the medium, short, and structural issues that need to be addressed. But I like to take a different tack. What would I like to see the administration and Congress do? I think that let's start from the fundamental. On self-determination, there might be a vote in the House Natural Resources Committee on both a statehood-only bill or a self-determination bill that includes statehood and other options. My guess is that's not going to go anywhere. If it does, it's not going to fly in the Senate. And so the Biden administration restarted a group that had been dormant under the Trump administration, which is a White House task force on Puerto Rico status, which under the Obama administration was expanded not just to deal with status, but with Vieques, Medicaid, and the economy. Unfortunately, the White House announced that it would not deal with status, that the task force would just deal with reconstruction and not even the fiscal issues, right? So I would love for the administration to actually follow the executive order that created the task force so that it does address fiscal and colonial issues, and that there's a pressure from people, not just in Florida, but in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and in Texas and other states that were key to the president's victory, to pressure members of Congress, but also the president, fulfill your promise. And if we do that, then the president will have to act. Otherwise, we'll just be talking about our dream of being like Cubans or the Jewish American community that have great power and use their diaspora in an effective way. We need to make it happen. We've already started, and I believe that with the people in this Zoom and others, we can make it happen.
Thank you so much to all the panelists. And now I'm going to turn it over to Zoe Colon to close out the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. You know, I think initially I thought I was gonna, you know, just come on and say thank you and goodbye, but I'm just so touched with everything, because even though we're talking about federal issues, we're also talking about real human issues, right? And so I'm really touched by some of the comments that were made. You know, people just want to go home. People are leaving out of desperation. So it's a reminder that this, at the very core, has everything to do with human rights, civil rights. And that, you know, whether you agree or not, to some extent, if not entirely, this is about being treated as second-class citizens. And so this was a reminder for me personally, that this is an important conversation to continue. So I just want to thank the panel. You all were so excellent. Thank you for your work that you do on our behalf. Being part of the diaspora, I fight really hard to try to move the needle on these issues, but I know we could be doing more, particularly across different sectors. So hopefully for folks that are outside of, you know, politics, who are, you know, in higher ed, in the business community, that you find a way to be involved and continue to support this movement, but also the greater good in the Latino community as we celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. Is important, not just to celebrate, but think about what needs to be done and how we can get involved. So I appreciate all of your comments. Thank you to everyone who participated and joined us today. Muchas gracias y nos vemos pronto, hopefully very soon. We hope to have you back at UCF